Elijah Boone was 43 years old, a logistics and operations man who had spent his career making sure things that other people depended on arrived where they were supposed to, on time, without anyone ever noticing the machinery behind it. He drove an 8-year-old sedan because it ran clean, and he saw no reason to replace it. He carried his lunch in the same dented steel container he'd used for a decade. That Tuesday afternoon, in a conference room at her attorney's office, his wife slid the divorce papers across the table, clicked her pen, and signed her name with a small, satisfied laugh. She told him she was finally free of the most boring man she'd ever met. Her attorney smiled. The boyfriend waiting in the lobby checked his phone. Elijah signed his own name beneath hers without a word. None of them in that building knew that the quiet man with the dented lunch container was worth $600 million. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The parking garage was cold and loud with the echo of distant engines when Elijah walked back to his car after the signing. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, without starting it. Up on the 4th level, the fluorescent lights buzzed in a frequency he'd long since stopped noticing. He set his copy of the signed papers on the passenger seat, squared it to the edge out of habit, and looked at it. He felt something loosen in his chest. Not grief, exactly. Something quieter. The particular feeling of finally being able to stop pretending he hadn't known where all of it was headed. For 9 years, Elijah had been the kind of man who kept his word like it was the only currency that mattered. He showed up early. He stayed late. When his wife Vanessa wanted something, he found a way, and he never made her feel the cost of it. He worked double shifts to cover the down payment on the house she'd fallen in love with. He drove 4 states to move her sister when no one else would. He paid for Vanessa's business courses, her certifications, the boutique she opened and then closed, and then opened again under a different name. He didn't know it then, but she had been telling people for 2 years that she was stuck. She had just been waiting for the boyfriend's lease to clear before she stopped pretending she wasn't already gone. Then, that Tuesday. And everything changed. She had dressed for it. He noticed that the way he noticed things, quietly, without announcing it, without deciding yet what it meant. The good blazer, fresh manicure. The earrings he'd given her for an anniversary she'd called forgettable. She had brought the papers, and she had brought an audience, her attorney on one side, and waiting just past the glass door, a man named Cordell whom she'd recently started describing as someone who actually gets me. "I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty," Vanessa said, in a voice that had clearly been practiced. "I've outgrown this. You're a good man, Elijah. You're just so painfully ordinary. You move boxes around for a living. You drive that sad little car. And I want a life that's bigger than a man who packs his own lunch." Elijah said nothing. "It's not personal," she added. And then she laughed. A light, genuine laugh, as if the whole thing were finally a relief. She clicked the pen. She signed. She slid the page toward him and watched, smiling, as if she wanted to see his face fall. It didn't fall. He read the page once. Then he picked up the pen she'd set down, signed his name in clean block letters, and capped it. "Okay," he said. That was all. One word. He stacked the pages, squared them, slid his copy into the inside pocket of his jacket, and stood. He thanked the attorney for his time, which seemed to confuse the man. As Elijah left, he heard Vanessa say something to Cordell about how typical it was, how Elijah never had anything to say, how she'd given the best years of her life to a man with no fire in him at all. He let the glass door close on the sentence. What Vanessa had never understood, what she was about to spend the next several months failing to understand, was the difference between a man with no fire and a man who simply never wasted it on things that didn't need burning. 6 years earlier, Elijah had stopped being only an operations manager. It had happened the way the important things in his life always happened, quietly, on a weekend, while everyone else was distracted. A regional freight and warehousing company he'd worked with for years was drowning. Bad ownership, worse debt. A logistics network that was actually sound underneath all the mismanagement. Elijah understood that network better than the people who owned it, because he'd spent his career inside systems exactly like it, finding the place where the flow broke. When a small private group came together to buy the distressed parent company out of its spiral and rebuild it, they needed someone who knew how the operation actually held together at ground level. Elijah put in his savings. Then he put in everything he'd quietly set aside over 20 years of living far below his means. He borrowed against nothing he couldn't cover, and he took equity instead of a title. Because a title was a thing people could see, and equity was a thing they couldn't. He never told Vanessa the scale of it. She knew he'd gotten into some investments. She'd rolled her eyes at it once, called it his little side thing, and never asked again because the details bored her. He let her keep being bored. By that Tuesday, the rebuilt company had grown, acquired, and consolidated into a privately held logistics group spanning warehousing, freight, and last-mile delivery across the region. Elijah held the controlling interest. On paper conservatively valued, his stake was worth a little over $600 million. He still drove the sedan. He still packed his lunch. The two facts had never felt contradictory to him for a single second. He found out something else the morning after the signing. When he finally read the financial disclosures Vanessa's attorney had filed, tucked into her list of accounts and obligations was a business entity, an LLC, and a man's name attached to it as co-member. Cordell Banks. And beneath that, a line item that made Elijah set the page down on the kitchen table and go very still. He had seen that LLC before. Not because of Vanessa. Because Cordell Banks ran a struggling third-party delivery contractor, a small outfit that, 8 months earlier, had signed a service agreement with one of the very companies inside Elijah's logistics group. Elijah had reviewed the contract himself, the way he reviewed everything, looking for where it might fail. He'd flagged it as high risk and approved it on a short leash. The man his wife had left him for was, by a chain of ownership she could not possibly have understood, a vendor who depended on Elijah's company to survive. That was what she hadn't understood. Until now. Her name was Adelaide Pryor, and she had managed contracts and vendor records for 33 years before she semi-retired. Small, straight-backed, silver hair pinned the same way every day, reading glasses on a chain. She'd stayed on part-time because, she said, sitting still made her teeth itch. She had taken a liking to Elijah years ago, back when he was just the operations man who actually read every line of every agreement, and she had never stopped watching out for him. She called him on Saturday. "Walter told me," she said. Walter was Elijah's attorney, patient and methodical. A man who called at 7 in the morning and never put drama into bad news. "Come by. Eat something first. Then I'll show you what I've kept." Adelaide's house smelled like coffee and cedar and something faintly sweet. She put a plate in front of him and waited until he'd finished before she set the first folder on the table. "I keep records," she said, "the way another person might say I breathe. And about a year ago, I started noticing something about one of our vendor contracts that didn't sit right. So I started a file." She opened it. Neat printouts, each dated and labeled in her careful hand. "I want to walk you through it in order." Elijah looked at the first page. He didn't react. He read. First, Adelaide said, your wife and Cordell Banks have been together far longer than she's letting on. There are signed delivery manifests and meeting logs, his company doing business adjacent to events she organized, going back well over a year. They've been careful, but careful people leave paper. The dates are all here. She slid them across. One of them is the weekend you told me you drove out to help her sister move. Elijah read the date. It matched. He filed it away. Second, she said, not pausing for his feelings because she knew he didn't want her to. The money. While you two were married, Vanessa moved personal funds into the LLC she co-owns with Cordell. And Cordell's company has been padding its invoices, billing our subsidiary for delivery volume it never actually moved. Phantom routes. Inflated mileage. Your wife helped him clean up the paperwork so it looked legitimate. He was bleeding, and she was keeping him afloat with money and with cover. Elijah folded his hands. How much? In overbilling I can document? Adelaide turned a page. A little over $400,000 across 8 months. Probably more upstream of what I can see. She set down a third folder. She opened this one slowly. Third, she said. And this is the part that's yours, Elijah. Cordell's contractor doesn't operate independently. It depends entirely on a service agreement with one of our subsidiaries to stay alive. I pulled the ownership chain all the way up, just to be certain of what I was looking at before I called you. She looked at him over her glasses. Read the controlling interest on the top line. Elijah already knew. He looked anyway. His own name, his own signature, scanned into the record. He stood over all 3 folders and didn't touch any single one of them. He looked at all of it together, the way he stood over a routing diagram when a whole region's freight had jammed, not reading any one node, but feeling where the lines connected. The affair. The stolen money. And the structural fact underneath both, the man his wife had laughed about trading up to, was a vendor surviving entirely on Elijah's company while quietly stealing from it. He could see the whole shape of it now. What do you want to do? Adelaide asked. Elijah closed the folder. I want to do it right, he said, and I want to do it slow. He didn't move fast. That was the part Vanessa had never been able to account for. She had spent 9 years deciding exactly what kind of man Elijah was. She had been wrong about the most important thing. She had mistaken patience for the absence of capability. It wasn't. Patience was his most practiced skill. It was just the one she'd never had reason to watch him use. He understood sequencing better than almost anyone alive. In logistics, the order of operations is the entire job. You don't dispatch the trucks before the load is staged. You don't reroute the network before you know exactly where the bottleneck sits. And you don't move on a man like Cordell Banks until every piece is staged and the route can't be reversed. So, he built. Quietly, the divorce was already signed, so there was nothing to contest there. And he let Vanessa believe she had walked away clean and victorious. He didn't call her. He didn't argue. His silence was its own kind of staging. Meanwhile, he made other calls. He brought in a forensic accountant, a precise woman named Della, who found false invoices the way Elijah found a broken link in a supply chain. He brought in the logistics group's compliance counsel, separately and confidentially, a quiet man named Okafor, who had spent his career reading contracts until he found the exact line where something had been bent. He gave them Adelaide's folders and told them to verify everything, find everything, and let nothing leave the room until he said so. It took weeks. Della pulled every invoice Cordell's company had submitted and matched them against the actual GPs and gate logs from the warehouses. The phantom routes lit up like shorts on a circuit map. The 400,000 became closer to 550 once she reconciled the full 8 months. She traced the LLC. She traced Vanessa's transfers in and the way the two of them had laundered the appearance of legitimacy through the contract. Elijah read every report once. Then he folded each one in half and in half again and stacked them in order in a single accordion file. He didn't make copies he didn't need. He didn't talk. He didn't post a word. He went to work, ran his operations, and gave no one any reason to think anything had changed. In the meantime, Cordell did what a man does when he thinks the money is permanent and no one is checking the gate logs. He leased a new car. He talked at a dinner Della later confirmed through an expense trail about expanding the company. Vanessa, for her part, told everyone who'd listen that she was finally with a real entrepreneur, a man who was going places. Elijah filed each of these away, too. Cordell believed he was insulated by a contract he assumed no one important was reading. He had no idea the man who controlled that contract had read every line of it twice and was simply waiting for the evidence and Cordell's own behavior to stack into something undeniable. That was exactly where Elijah needed him. Vanessa called him once, near the end of it. Her voice had gone a little softer. She'd heard, somehow, through a mutual acquaintance, that Elijah had done better than anyone thought, and she wanted to know if maybe they could be adult about everything for old time's sake. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Cordell's business had hit a rough patch lately and that things were tighter than they should be. Elijah listened to the whole thing. "I think everything can be resolved cleanly," he said, his voice even. "Cooperative. Let's get the right people in one room, Cordell included, and the attorneys. I'd rather close out every loose end at once." She agreed before he finished the sentence. He could hear the relief she was trying to keep out of her voice, and mostly failing. He ended the call. Adelaide was sitting across the table, a mug held in both hands. She hadn't said a word the whole time. "She thinks it's already over," Elijah said. Adelaide said nothing. She reached over and refilled his coffee. Elijah arrived 40 minutes early. He liked it that way. In a warehouse, the first one on the floor set the pace for the whole shift. The room was on the 11th floor of a downtown office tower. A conference room with a long table, neutral gray walls, nothing on them. The city laid out flat and bright through a wall of glass. The kind of room where things become official. The kind of room where an argument turns into a proceeding, because arguments can be waved off and proceedings cannot. Walter arrived next, unhurried, a single folder set in front of his chair. Della came with Okafor, the compliance counsel, and they arranged their documents in silence. The room was very still. Far below the glass, traffic moved without sound. Vanessa and Cordell came in together. That was the first signal. They came in the way people arrive somewhere they expect to enjoy. Vanessa was dressed for victory and wore the small, ready smile of someone who believed she'd already won the only round that mattered. She glanced at Elijah once, a quick, professional assessment, and then turned to Walter as though Elijah were simply furniture in the room. Cordell carried himself like a man whose biggest worry was where to park. He even gave Elijah a nod, friendly, the gracious winner. Their attorney, young and expensively dressed, looked comfortable beside them. Walter opened the meeting. "Thank you all for coming. Before we discuss anything regarding the dissolution, there are several matters that require acknowledgement from everyone at this table." He opened his folder. He began to lay documents down, one at a time, with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this many times. "The first item," Walter said. "During the marriage, personal funds were transferred into an LLC jointly held by Miss Vanessa and Mr. Banks He laid the page down. Those transfers, combined with the related business activity, total a significant sum and are fully documented. He let it sit. This becomes relevant in light of the second item. Della placed the forensic report on the table and walked through it. Voice even, factual, not cold, simply precise. Mr. Banks's company holds a service agreement with one of our subsidiaries. Over the past 8 months, that company submitted invoices for delivery volume that the warehouse gate logs and GPS records show was never moved. She laid down the reconciliation. Phantom routes. Inflated mileage. The overbilling totals just under $550,000. The paperwork was prepared to appear legitimate. Cordell's smile thinned. "Look," he said, "any billing disputes are between my company and whoever manages that contract on your side. I'll talk to my account rep. There's no reason this belongs in a divorce meeting." "That's the third item," Okafor said quietly. He placed a single sheet in front of Cordell. It was the ownership chain of the logistics group that held the subsidiary Cordell's company depended on. The controlling interest was highlighted. "Mr. Banks, I represent the parent entity that holds the controlling interest in the company your contract relies on. I'll be precise about what we are and are not saying. We are not today, in this room, filing a criminal complaint. We are disclosing that this documentation exists, that it has been preserved, and that the controlling owner is fully aware of all of it." Cordell looked at the sheet a long moment. "And who," he said, slower now, "is the controlling owner?" Okafor didn't answer. He simply turned, with everyone else in the room, toward the man at the end of the table, who had not yet said a single word. Vanessa's expression went through several things in the space of 2 seconds: recognition, confusion, then something that looked very much like the floor opening beneath her. She had worked, the entire meeting, to keep her face from changing, and that effort became suddenly visible to anyone watching closely enough. Elijah was watching closely enough. The silence in the room lasted 9 seconds. Elijah counted them. "Then, Walter, evenly, will allow a few minutes for your attorneys to review." Elijah stood. He gathered nothing from the table. He had brought only the one accordion file, and it had served its purpose. He buttoned his jacket. He shook Walter's hand, and Okafor's, and Della's. He walked toward the door. He stopped beside Vanessa's chair. He said it quietly, only for her, not as performance, because it was meant for her. "You laughed when you signed it," he said. "I just needed you gone long enough for the world to find out what I was worth." He turned to Cordell, who had gone gray around the mouth. He didn't raise his voice for him either. "That contract keeping your company alive," Elijah said. "It's mine. It always was." He walked out without looking back. It did not happen all at once. The service agreement Cordell's company depended on was terminated for cause within the week. The overbilling referred for civil recovery of what could be recovered. Without the contract, the lifeline was gone, and the small company that had been surviving on phantom invoices folded in stages. The leased car went back. The expansion talk stopped. The people who had taken Cordell's calls began letting them go to voicemail. He was not destroyed dramatically. He was simply reduced to the size of a man who had built his life on volume he never actually moved. Vanessa, named on the LLC and tied to the laundered paperwork, found herself liable for her share. The clean, victorious exit she described so confidently to her own attorney never materialized. There was nothing left to claim once the full picture assembled. The acquaintances who'd been so impressed by her real entrepreneur drifted off. She was carrying the weight of what she had chosen. the way a person carries something they cannot set down. Not dramatically, just constantly. Elijah was building something, not fast. The way he built everything. He replaced Cordell's failed contractor with a clean, well-run operator, kept the routes moving, and protected the drivers who'd had nothing to do with any of it. His name still wasn't on the building. He preferred it that way. He answered every call the same day. He gave accurate timelines and hit them. He was not rich in the way Vanessa had imagined richness. He was solid in a way she had never once been able to picture. 14 months later, he finally repainted the kitchen in the house she'd fallen in love with, and then walked out of. It took him 3 weekends. Adelaide came by when he was done and brought a small potted succulent. No card, just the plant. He set it on the windowsill above the sink. He watered it on Thursdays. On a clear evening in early spring, Elijah sat on his back porch with a glass of water and listened to the neighborhood settle into the dark. Somewhere a few streets over, a truck downshifted on the long grade toward the highway, and out of habit he knew which route it was running. He could hear his neighbors talking low on a porch nearby, and underneath it the steady, ordinary hum of a city whose freight kept moving, because men like him made sure of it without ever being seen. He thought, for a moment, about the small, satisfied laugh and the click of the pen. Then he stopped thinking about it, because it was no longer load-bearing in his life. He finished his water, he went inside, and turned out the light. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.